First Samuel 2, 1 to 10. 2, 1 to 10. Right to there. So, and then the second one is
This print's too big. I can't read this.
then Matthew chapter 1, 18 to 23, starting right there. It goes down. Now, are you paying attention?
Samuel.
That's right. First Samuel chapter 2, 1 to 10.
Right to there.
That's right. To the end. Just before you get to 11.
That's not 11, that's 2. Those look like Roman numerals. And then, where'd this book come from?
It's
18 to 23, I have to turn the page. How am I going to do that? Sure you don't want to do this, Cindy? Is this thing on?
You're also live.
Oh. You YouTubing this? You better cut that part out. We better splice this part out. Get on that, would you?
Greg, would you go downstairs just to make sure people know we're going to start in a minute? Just to let them know. Thanks. So I just think this might be a helpful thing to help us refocus again now, consideration of what Chris was saying about interiority and the vastness of the soul on the one hand, and then the way we tend to ignore that and focus on the externals. And there's this wonderful poem by Malcolm Guite. The name is Annunciation. The name of the poem is Annunciation. It's in his Sounding the Seasons collection of poetry, but it speaks about that exteriority that people tend to cling to and our preoccupation with that, but never on the interior, and how, by contrast, Mary, in the moment of Annunciation by the angel, the visit of Gabriel, suddenly she begins to consider the question that Gabriel's asked, will you be the God-bearer? And so I just wanted to read this for you, and then we'll start our third address with Chris, and then following that there'll probably be a few minutes of quiet time before we have our final evensong. And at the conclusion of the evensong, we'll thank Chris again for his leadership in this retreat. So, Annunciation. We see so little, stayed on surfaces, we calculate the outsides of all things. Preoccupied with our own purposes, we miss the shimmer of the angels' wings. They coruscate around us in their joy, a swirl of wheels and eyes and wings unfurled. They guard the good we purpose to destroy, a hidden blaze of glory in God's world. But on this day, a young girl stopped to see with open eyes and heart. She heard the voice, the promise of his glory yet to be. As time stood still for her to make a choice, Gabriel knelt and not a feather stirred. The Word himself was waiting on her word. So, welcome, Chris.
It's always difficult to speak after lunch because food weighs us down. So hopefully we will all make it through. This is final address for the retreat. The title for this address, as you'll see, is He Loved Them to the End. And those words, of course, are a reference to Christ, who the scriptures tell us loved his own to the end. But I wanted to use them as a way for us to reflect on love of neighbor, love of others, partly because St. Mary of Paris, Mary Skobtsova, who died in a concentration camp in the Second World War, observing the world, made this very simple observation, that the world is an abomination unless we love to the end and without exception. So I thought this would be helpful for us to think both about Christ's love for us to the end, but then our call to love one another to the end. So the first words of John's Gospel is where I wanted to begin. The first words in John's Gospel that are attributed to Jesus are remarkably poignant, but I thought I might ask if anyone is actually, some of you may be aware of Christ's first words in John's Gospel. Anyone? No, I thought I would check because I had a feeling I think it's very likely in the last 17 years you might have had a sermon about them. But the very first words of Jesus in John's Gospel, they are, I think, as unexpected as they are poignant. His first words are, "What are you looking for? What are you looking for?" It'd be possible for us to spend a long time thinking about this question. I suspect if we were to ask it to one another, we would answer it probably in diverse ways with some points of connection, starting with the particular things that we are seeking, maybe healing or satisfying work or some form of reconciliation in our life with another. And then perhaps moving deeper to the things that often percolate below our more obvious hopes. We might say that we're looking for security, or to know that in the end everything will be okay, or to know that we're loved. These deeper desires, I think, are captured in this remarkable exchange that Jesus has with two of the disciples at the beginning of John's Gospel. He asks them, "What are you looking for?" And they respond, "Where do you live?" So if we had time, I think, again, we might kind of pause and try to feel our way into that question, the question of the disciples, where do you live? But for now, let's just note that Jesus responds to this question with a very simple invitation. He simply says, "Come and see." So in this brief exchange at the beginning of John's Gospel, more or less, it seems to me the entire human condition is somehow captured. That is to say, there is an invitation to know or to discover what it is we want. What are you looking for? And there's an invitation to discover where what we desire most might be found. Come and see. Of course, in the gospel, it's clear that what we desire is to be with Christ, and our yearning is to be at home with him. But if you think about the gospels, there is a kind of strange response that they give to this question, where do you live? Where does the Christ live? On the one hand, the answer of the Gospels is strange because Jesus himself is an itinerant preacher, right? He has no fixed address. So whatever it is, or wherever it is that he lives, it's not at a local address in the way that we live at local addresses. But not only is he an itinerant preacher wandering from town to town, but he makes the very strange claim that seems to indicate that he in fact has no home. You may remember these interesting words of Christ. He says, "Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." So a prolonged reading of the Gospels, I think, makes clear that whatever else it may mean to come and see where Jesus lives, it means that at least this: not to come to any geographical space, as if the Lord lived in Jerusalem, so we have to make pilgrimage, or he lives in Rome or Damascus, but rather to be where Christ lives is, in the first instance, I think the Gospels suggest from beginning to end, to be in a relationship with him. Or to use a slightly different word, to be in communion, that he lives in communion. This is true, of course, of Christ the Word, the second person of the Trinity. He is in communion with the Father and the Spirit, and it's true of his life with us, that he lives in relationship. So we saw this morning that the place of communion, the place where we gather with Christ, in the first instance is in our hearts. But this afternoon I'd like to suggest that it's not only in us that we can find the Lord waiting and loving and watching. Rather, to be with Christ where he lives is not only in the heart by prayer, and it's not even only in the scriptures or only in the sacramental mysteries of the church, but rather this afternoon I'd like to suggest amongst all the Christian disciplines that to be with Jesus, or to discover where he lives, is to discover the home he makes in each of our neighbors. As Jesus himself says, he is in the prisoner and in the homeless and in the sick and the hungry. So that's basically be my argument, right? That I'm going to try to argue that Christ is many places. He plays in many fields, but one of the fields in which he plays is the field of our neighbor, right? He is in them and to be found in them. And it seems to me, if we can take this claim seriously, the world actually becomes for Christians a different place than it is for other people. The world is different if we see it as a place in which Christ is alive in every neighbor than it is if we don't see it as such. We could maybe talk about the difference later. But more importantly, the reason I wanted to raise this idea of Christ in the neighbor is because I think if we internalize this reality, we have a place to look every time it seems that Christ is absent from us. Right? So really internalizing the idea that Jesus is in every neighbor is a source of great consolation when we go through dry periods in our own spiritual lives and it seems that Christ is not with us, right? We know that we can always find him in the other person. As the great American saint Dorothy Day writes, it is with the voice of our contemporaries that Christ speaks, with the eyes of store clerks and factory workers and children that he gazes, with the hands of office workers, slum dwellers, and suburban housewives that he gives. It is with the feet of soldiers and tramps that he walks, and with the heart of anyone in need that he longs for shelter. And giving shelter or food to anyone who asks or needs is giving to Christ. We can do now what those who knew him in the days of his flesh did then. So over the next 2 weeks, the church is going to present us an image. So starting tomorrow with Passion Sunday and sort of the old reckoning. Over the next 2 weeks, the church will present us Christ's loving of the world to the end. And the end here, I think, as many of you will know, means really two things. Both loving it all the way to his death, because he must die in order to find those who do die, right? He has to go to where we are. But also loving it to its purpose. That's the other meaning of end, of course. Loving the world to its fruition, to its purpose, which we will encounter, of course, on Easter Sunday. But to think about what it means to love as Jesus loves, always to the end and without exception, I thought it might be helpful just to reflect on the example of someone, and there are, of course, countless, but the example of one person who sought to offer her life in imitation of Christ. And the person I'd like to think about is Dorothy Day. She is currently, as you may know, in the process for canonization in the Roman Catholic Church, formerly now has the title Servant of God. So she's, sort of 2 steps into the process, effectively. But I'd like to consider her partly because she's meant a great deal to me personally, partly also, though, because she is an American, and I think offers us some hope that the life of the saints is for us, not for others. As many have said before, not to be a saint is really the only sadness. And there are 2 things in her way of life that I'd really like to highlight. So I'm going to just try to tell the story of her life and try to highlight 2 themes in her understanding of love for neighbor. She talks, on the one hand, about personal sacrifice as a condition of love. And on the other hand, she talks about a very strange concept, which she calls voluntary poverty. I'd just like to think about both of those as maybe part and parcel in some way of our love for one another. But just to maybe remind us of Dorothy Day's life. Dorothy Day was born in 1897 in Brooklyn, New York, though she spent her teenage years in Chicago, where her father worked for the local newspaper. And I think it's no doubt because of his work in the newspaper that she first had the seeds of her own writing vocation sown, in a way, as a result of her father's work. But it was in Chicago, she tells us, that she would walk her baby brother, push him in a stroller, through the very expansive working-class tenements in the city's southeast. And it was during these walks that Day began to sense that her life was somehow intimately connected with the lives of the poor and the working class. These early experiences found expression, as they often do, I think, for many of us and for many young people, found expression in an aggressively left-wing politics, whose general commitments in some ways she never abandoned. So she became an anarchist at a very young age, and in many ways was called a Catholic anarchist all the way to the time of her death. I don't know enough about anarchism as a political theory to tell you much about it, but there's probably other folks here who could. In her late teenage years, Dorothy Day moved to New York. She moved on her own to New York, where she worked as a journalist for a number of politically radical newspapers, while slowly making a home with the kind of avant-garde political and literary culture in the city. An early love affair led to an unexpected pregnancy, which was followed, she tells us, by a complicated abortion, which Day translated into an autobiographical novel. And she eventually sold the rights to the book to a film company. And the novel's title is actually of interest to us, I think. It's called The 11th Virgin, so a reference to the wise and foolish virgins in the scriptures. So she was already thinking, in some ways, or developing a religious sensibility. But whatever the case, the money she received from selling those rights allowed her to purchase a beachside home on Long Island. And it was there that she fell in love this time with a British socialist. They made their home together on the beach, and Dorothy eventually found herself pregnant again. As one biographer notes, for Dorothy, this second pregnancy, I'm just quoting the biographer, quote, filled her with an overwhelming sense of God's mercy that was to remain with her for the rest of her life. She had assumed that the medical complications of her earlier abortion had actually left her incapable of having children. So she looked upon the birth of her daughter as a genuine miracle. As the young child grew, Dorothy Day, who, remember, had effectively been an atheist left-winger, Dorothy found herself spontaneously praying repeatedly in gratitude and in thanksgiving for the gift of this child. So she decided eventually, she didn't know a lot about the various churches, eventually to have her child baptized in the closest Roman Catholic church, and she was herself baptized in the same church a year later. So she actually had her daughter baptized before she was baptized. Her reception into the church, Dorothy Day was a pretty intense personality, effectively ended her romantic relationship. She wasn't seeking to leave her partner, but the socialist impulses and commitments of her partner couldn't really tolerate the idea that someone would, already having cast off the yoke of middle-class values, would then take on the yoke of the church. That just seemed impossible to him. So this leaves Dorothy and Tamar, her daughter, in some ways adrift. In many ways, the next most decisive moment for Dorothy Day was December 8th in 1932. Dorothy had gone to Washington, and she spent much of the day praying at the shrine to the Immaculate Conception there. December 8th, of course, is the Feast of the Conception of the Virgin Mary, or the Immaculate Conception in the Catholic Church. And there she prayed and asked that God would show her a means, some way, of using her gifts as a writer to care for the poor. The next day, she returned home to New York, and she was met at the door of her apartment by a man named Peter Morin. Peter was a largely self-educated child of peasant farmers from France who had a vision of Catholic social teaching as what he called a radical dynamite, that there was this whole tradition of teaching about care for the poor in the church's life that was simply waiting to be rediscovered and reapplied. So Peter Morin's vision then for Day, this was an answer to prayer. She saw in Peter someone who could both teach her and instruct her in the church's teaching, historical teaching about care and solidarity with the poor. And it dovetailed, of course, with Day's own desire to serve the poorest of the poor. So together they would go on to found a movement that some of you may be familiar with, the Catholic Workers Movement. It's a movement that still continues. In fact, Cleveland has a Catholic workers community of its own. So there were many aspects of the Catholic worker movement plan, but among the first was the Catholic worker newspaper, a one-penny newspaper, which became the primary vehicle for the spread of the movement's ideas. Through Morin's influence, Day discovered that her radical political commitments actually had a home and a kind of fullness, of sort of fuller explication within the teaching tradition of the church, which on the one hand obliged Christians to seek the transformation of unjust social structures. So you might think of the Christian abolition movement in the late 18th, early 19th century. But on the other hand, of course, called Christians not just to try to change structures, but to actually develop relationships of personal love and care for concrete individuals, right? So it wasn't that the church's tradition said you have to go out and sort of change all the structures in the world, but rather that it also emphasized strongly and intensely personal care for real people on a one-to-one basis. So in addition to founding the paper then, the workers' movement called for the establishment of farms and urban houses of hospitality. That's what they were called, for the poor. Day described these homes to a visiting social worker who asked her one day, how long can people who come to these houses of hospitality in New York City, how long can they actually stay here? And Day responded by saying, we let them stay forever. They live with us, they die with us, and we give them a Christian burial. We pray for them after they are dead. And once they are taken in, they become members of the family, or rather, they always were members of the family. They are our brothers and our sisters in Christ. So these homes, effectively for people who were destitute or in many cases struggling with significant either mental health or substance abuse issues, were not only places for food and fellowship, but also places for respite, for healing, for study, and for prayer. So there were study groups in all of these homes, people being encouraged to read and reading along great classics of the Christian spiritual tradition. As Peter Morin had discovered in his study of Catholic social teaching, houses for the poor were actually mandated canonically in the Roman Catholic Church to be a part of every single diocese. And so Morin traveled the country exhorting bishops to be obedient to their own spiritual tradition, to begin opening houses of hospitality. And he went further and argued that what the church did on a larger scale, dioceses opening these homes, Christian families should do on a small scale by sanctifying what he called a Christ room in their house, where they would welcome anyone in need of housing or food or spiritual respite. So that's a lot to say, maybe just a little bit about Day's life. But Day was very quick to point out that though in some ways her life is not unlike Mother Teresa's, that is to say, it looks from the outside like a series of really quite extraordinary charitable deeds, Day herself noted that to see her life in that way would be to miss the real and deeper character of her life. She wrote, "We feed the hungry, yes. We try to shelter the homeless and we give them clothes, and there is strong faith at work." But then she went on to say, "We pray. If an outsider who came to visit us does not pay attention to our praying and what that means, then that person will miss the entire point." And so one person observed of Dorothy Day that he had never met anyone, not even in a monastery, more prayerful. He said, "When I think of her first of all on her knees praying before the sacrament. I think of the long list of names she kept of people living and dead to pray for. I think of her at Mass. I think of her praying the rosary. I think of her going off to make confession every Saturday evening." So prayer was fundamental for Day because the work of her life was not simply the eradication of worldly poverty. That wasn't her goal. But rather, what she was seeking was what she called a revolution of the heart. It is living from day to day, she observed, taking no thought for the morrow, seeing Christ in all who come, and trying literally to follow the gospel that resulted in our work. The daily adoration of Christ in prayer was the way she was able to adore Christ present in her neighbor, and to allow her neighbor to serve the same Christ in herself. So I mentioned all of this, yes, is just a way of, in some ways, trying to describe the character of Dorothy Day, but I mentioned there are two aspects of her notion of love of neighbor that I think are really crucial and may be helpful for us to think of as Christian disciplines. The first is the notion of sacrifice, which she received from her friend and mentor, Peter Morin. So firstly, Peter Morin insisted that all love demands sacrifice. "We cannot see our brother," he wrote, "our brother in need without stripping ourselves. It is the only way we have of showing our love." Now, Morin uses very extreme language, right? Obviously, he's using the language of sort of taking off one's cloak and giving it to someone who is in need. He uses sort of extreme language. But for many of us, I suspect, this habit of loving self-sacrifice with respect to immediate friends and family is probably both so normal that it is likely so normal that it is almost invisible to us, right? We make tea for a partner, or we take a friend for a meal, or we welcome someone into our home, right? So we're engaged in sort of acts of love that do make some demand on us all the time. Even as a culture, we enable the state to care for the poor through programs funded by our taxes. So in both cases, there is a kind of sacrifice happening, right? But one that is either so habitual, the ways we love our family, for example, as to be almost invisible and normal, or ones that are involuntary, like paying, well, I don't, maybe you voluntarily pay your taxes, but I'll just assume none of us really like to pay taxes, or involuntary, like paying taxes, but we pay them in the hopes that they'll do some good in the world, right? They'll do some good in the world. But Day had a sense that the call in the Christian context to love our neighbor was something more than simply loving those close at hand. It wasn't less than that, but was also something more. And it was something more than loving those with whom we simply have natural affinities, so our friends, for example. Because the call of Christ, as Day saw clearly, is to love both where we are least comfortable, in, for example, places of desperation or illness or despair. And more profoundly, Christ says that our vocation as Christians is to love even our enemies. As we'll be reminded in Holy Week, the model of Christ's love includes among his disciples those who will betray him, and he prays for the forgiveness of those who drive the nails into his hands. Right? So Christ's model of love is extreme, right? So the enemies are present, right? But he even includes them within his inner circle. Knowingly, he includes those who would destroy him within his circle. This emphasis on personal care for others, I think, for all of her left-wing tendencies, made Day actually, and I think this is something very interesting to think about, made her very anxious as she watched the establishment of the welfare state in America. For all of the good it accomplishes, Day was convinced that in many respects it was a failure and even a temptation. It's a very strange idea, I think probably for most of us, certainly as a Canadian, it's a very strange idea that you could have any question about the moral goodness, the clear moral goodness of the social safety net with which we live. But for Day, her anxieties emerged in part because she encountered such huge numbers of people at the Catholic worker shelters who fell through the cracks of the various government institutions established to care for those most in need. Right? So there was kind of obvious evidence to her that these are not working. But more importantly, Day was deeply concerned that government alone could not provide either community or solidarity or works of mercy and love. And that Christians might be tempted to offload their own responsibilities to love one another onto the government. And so she writes, in our generation, more and more we've come to consider the state as a kind of bountiful Uncle Sam. Uncle Sam will take care of it all. The race question, the labor question, the unemployment question will all be registered and will be tabulated, will be employed, or will be put on the dole. Of course, if you spend any time in the urban inner city, really anywhere in North America, you'll have had the opportunity to see precisely the way in which the poorest of us endure the daily humiliations of being in one way or another institutionalized, dealt with often by extraordinarily caring people, but in contexts that pressure them to see the weak and the powerless as essentially problems that need to be solved. So for Day and Morin, this is not, of course they weren't saying not to have some kind of social safety net, but Day wanted to point out where the problems arise if we're tempted to think that that is sufficient. For Day and Morin, the state simply cannot understand the deeper realities of human relationships, at least the realities that animate the Christian tradition, which is that we are members one of another. And so she feared that Christians might lose their commitment to hard love if they too easily defaulted to government intervention, forgetting that personal encounters and long-term commitments to involve one's own life with another, not as objects to be served, but as Christ to be adored, that is the deepest and most profound expression of human love. It is love to the end and without exception. So this habit, of course, this requires a kind of sacrifice. And this habit of personal sacrifice was intended to combat what Peter Morin saw increasingly as a contemporary culture of acquisitiveness. So for Morin, the idea was that one goes out of oneself by genuinely giving to others of one's own in order to combat certain habits of acquisitiveness. So that sacrifice, so the first thing, but which I think we can sort of see clearly from our own regular habits of sacrifice for those whom we love, but also maybe can understand clearly as something that can grow beyond even those domestic sacrifices. The second habit that Morin and Day insisted upon as an extension of personal sacrifice is what they called voluntary poverty. This was key to Morin's whole thought, and it was fundamental to the Catholic workers' houses of hospitality, to their farms, and to their newspaper. But it's also, I think, the most difficult and challenging of Dorothy Day's legacy, aspect of her legacy. And in some ways, I find it actually very hard to talk about because it's extremely difficult to live. I certainly don't live it, but I'm going to pose it, suggest it as a Christian discipline that we can probably, in all of our lives, find some way of inhabiting, even in very small ways. So voluntary poverty for Dorothy Day is simply the practical expression of authentic personal sacrifice. This sacrifice for her requires not that we give to others simply what is left over from our abundance, but that we give first and foremost from the abundance itself. And to use an economic example, you might say, Day wants us to endlessly eat into the principle of our love and not feed others simply on the interest. The early days of the Catholic worker movement were quite radical from this perspective in their embrace of this vision. As Dorothy Day notes, they were completely disorganized, but they were convinced that God would supply their needs, provided they were generous. So as quickly as they gave away food, she discovered more food would appear. Furniture and clothing, they would give even things off their own backs, and just as quickly these same things materialized again. The point was that this practice of a kind of poverty loosened their grip on the things of the world. And for this reason, Day and Morin would argue that it's key to a certain kind of freedom. It begins for many by giving away a crust of bread, she would say, but then a piece of clothing or a cup of water. But then it becomes deeper as people learn to give away time and privacy, and to surrender even our indignity when we are interrupted or when unexpected demands arise. This for Day was a constant battle. She said, we hold on to ourselves, our time and our privacy, our books and our clothes and our typewriters, instead of rejoicing when all of these things are taken away. We protest when our privacy is interrupted. We hold on too strongly to these goods. So the repetition in our lives of Christ's own self-emptying. So Christ's self-emptying, often called his kenosis, that Christ comes down from heaven. He empties himself in order to be amongst us. For that to be repeated in our lives, To put it another way, the repetition in our lives of the manger and its poverty, or the repetition in our lives of the hidden life of Jesus in Nazareth, those 30 years of anonymity when he simply labors and lives as a member of a family. This constitutes a poverty that for Day and Morin is the very essence of freedom. We must keep on talking about voluntary poverty, Day wrote, and holy poverty, because it is only if we can consent to strip ourselves that we can put on Christ. It is only if we love poverty that we are going to have the means to help others. If we love poverty, we will be free to give up a job, to speak when we feel it would be wrong to be silent. We can only talk about voluntary poverty because we believe Christians must be fools for Christ. We can embrace it only in the light of faith. So essential to the whole notion of voluntary poverty, and the way in which I think it's most accessible, likely for most of us who have families and financial obligations and responsibilities and properties and homes, when we have all of these things. And Day's call, I think, is not essentially that we simply surrender all of these things and go and live on the street in New York. I don't think that's actually Day's point. I think her point is that small practices of surrender, sacrifice, small practices of giving, loosen the hold that the material world has on us, and that we have a tendency to pile up or to surround ourselves with the matter of the world in order to save us from dealing with the more fundamental dependencies and poverties that belong to the human condition. For Day, and this I think is the shortest of the talks, I just have a minute left really. For Day, really at the heart of this notion of voluntary poverty, or for it to be authentic and not simply romantic, right? I mean, think one can sort of imagine maybe folks who have a kind of romantic notion that somehow living in a certain kind of poverty is just good somehow. For her to authentically live into a sort of voluntary poverty required in her mind that the Catholic worker communities experienced what those who live in poverty experience every day, a sense of precariousness, their own vulnerability, the sense that things can crumble very, very quickly. This, of course, is just reality, right? That's just life, that life can go south very, very quickly. And Day was convinced or determined that for Christians to understand the world and their place in it, they needed to embrace that reality, to live in the face of it. As one priest noted in an article by Day, is quoted by Day, he says, the desire to build and to grow and to get bigger in our parishes is fine as far as it goes. But usually the first casualty of this desire for growth is the poor. To be in solidarity is to live on the edge that induces and compels faith. You might think about that as a sort of parish. There's no parish that has a mission statement, right? Come and live with us because we're precarious. It's a precarious place to be, right? Those are not our parish mission statements. But in a certain sense, Christianity and other religious traditions as well, but Christianity, of course, acknowledges that there's contingency built into our lives, a real precariousness. And Day is simply calling people to be willing to live at that edge in solidarity with the world and perhaps with those most vulnerable in it. But I'll just conclude this talk with these words. Dorothy Day's autobiography, some of you I'm sure will have read it, is called The Long Loneliness. The title is the secret, I think, that's at the heart of her idea of love of neighbor. She writes, "We have all known the long loneliness. That is, she means we've all known the agony of isolation, of being misunderstood, of seeming a riddle even to ourselves. But we have learned," she says, "that the only solution to the long loneliness is love, and that love comes with community." And she goes on to write, "To love with understanding and without understanding, to love blindly and to the point of folly, to see only what is lovable, to think only on these things, to see the best in everyone, their virtues rather than their faults, to see Christ in them. To come to this place of love for Day, or even to wish to be in that place, was from her perspective already to be on the way home to life with Christ, to come and see where he dwells. So the first words, just to finally, of Christ in John's Gospel are, what are you seeking? The answer, I think, is surely at some level for all of us, that what we seek is to come home. Right? All the great stories in most of the history of the world are stories of homecoming, seeking a way through the long loneliness. And it may be in part, I think, that the secret of our return home to Christ is learning to see that the way home is not simply for ourselves, but that getting home is for one another. Or to put this another way, that to arrive at the home we seek, the Christian tradition, I think, argues unequivocally, we must both be willing to be carried. In Holy Week, of course, we will see ourselves carried by Christ, but also a willingness then to carry each other. It's in this sort of dialectic of being carried and then carrying one another that we are empowered to undertake the Christian life. Or you might say that we enter into the fundamental discipline of Christian living, which is to be loved, and in response to that love, to love in return. So thank you all so much for your attentiveness for all of these addresses. Thank you. Yes, that was her first novel, yeah. And first and I think only novel, actually. She wrote before her conversion, essentially as a kind of autobiographical account of this love affair and the pregnancy and the abortion as well. Yeah, yeah. I was thinking as I was speaking, I was really trying to decide whether to talk about Dorothy Day or Maria Skoptsova, but in this talk, but if you have a chance, I encourage you to look up Maria Skoptsova, St. Mary of Paris, as she is now called in the Orthodox Church, but her story is very similar to Day's in terms of coming from just a very interesting secular political background, lots of husbands, and then all of a sudden becoming a nun just before the Second World War in the Orthodox Church, but then founding homes in Paris for the homeless and the hungry. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But she was eventually deported to a concentration camp where she died.
So I was very interested to hear your description of Day's life and her thinking. And this is an experience that many people will have had if they've worked with any of the government-sponsored institutions that are responsible for things like, we consider safety net programs, especially for single mothers and children at Christmas time and various other things. And there's just this more generalized sort of feeling that there's this generalized feeling that there's just an enormity of, we're getting a storm.
We are, yeah.
Yeah, so I think we're okay though.